In the sacrosanct halls of Versailles, an unholy spectacle unfolded, orchestrated by the very man who had once claimed to be the Sun King, the chosen ruler of France by divine will. Louis XIV, the monarch who had ruled for an astonishing 72 years, who had built Versailles as a monument to his glory and power, who had reshaped the political and military map of Europe, was about to experience the most humbling and horrifying end imaginable. And he would endure it fully conscious. There's something uniquely terrifying about watching your own body betray you. Most who suffer gangrene die swiftly, often from septic shock, slipping into the darkness of coma as their body's defenses collapse. Yet, in August of 1715, Louis XIV was no ordinary victim. For 22 days, he remained awake, aware, and fully conscious while his legs turned black, liquefied, and slowly fell apart. He could smell the creeping rot. The surgeons who attended him would later report that the gangrene had penetrated to the bone, yet he retained lucidity almost to the very end. This was not the battlefield horror of a soldier, nor the indiscriminate wrath of the plague. This was the Sun King, Louis XIV, whose very life had been a performance of absolute power and divine authority, now confronted with the unyielding brutality of nature. A black spot appeared on his leg after a hunting trip, a trivial blemish in appearance, but one that heralded the collapse of a reign and the fall of a godlike figure into human mortality. At Versailles, the doctors debated and delayed. Immediate amputation could have saved his life, but his medical advisors argued for weeks, citing gout, sciatica, and other ailments, while his flesh rotted from the feet upward. By the time the grim reality was acknowledged, the infection had advanced past all hope. One surgeon finally had the courage to speak plainly, "Sire, we can remove your legs, but we cannot save your life." What followed in Louis XIV's bedchamber between August 10 and September 1 was so grotesque that even embalmers balked. The Sun King did not simply die. He lingered, conscious and suffering, as necrosis consumed his body day by day. Courtiers fled the chamber gagging, servants burned incense continuously to mask the stench, and yet Louis conducted state affairs from his bed, still signing decrees, still attempting to govern a kingdom he had ruled for more than 7 decades. Before we reach those final moments, before the surgeons pressed their fingers into the liquefied flesh, before the room filled with the unbearable odor of decay, it's vital to understand the man behind the throne and the empire he controlled. On the morning of August 10, 1715, Louis XIV awoke in the same routine he had perfected over 76 years. Rising sharply at 8:30 a.m. for the grand lever, he performed the intricate ceremony in which carefully chosen nobles watched him dress, each button and buckle a ritual of sacred significance. This was followed by chapel, council meetings, and a public dinner, every motion choreographed to reinforce his image as the divine monarch, the fixed center of the French universe. Even at 76, he maintained a rigorous schedule. On that day, he had spent the morning hunting at Marly, a forest retreat he had frequented since boyhood. Riding for hours, he displayed the endurance of youth, the strength of a man who had wielded armies and dictated treaties. Courtiers accompanying him recalled his jovial spirit, noting nothing amiss. Yet, as he returned to Versailles, a subtle pain made itself known, a sharp, stabbing sensation just above the knee. Trivial to some, but significant enough to make him shift uneasily in his saddle. By the time his carriage passed through the palace gates, Louis limped slightly, a small herald of the catastrophic events to come. His chief physician, Guy Crescent Fagan, diagnosed him hastily with sciatica. A bit of rest, some medicinal treatments, and the king would allegedly be back in form within days. But Louis XIV could not rest. He could not, or rather, he would not. For 72 years, he had cultivated the image of invincibility. Weakness was unthinkable. He arose the next morning for the lever, presided over mass, conducted state meetings, all while masking a pain that gnawed relentlessly at his body. Those close to him noticed subtle signs, the way he gripped the arms of his chair until knuckles whitened, beads of sweat on his brow despite the cool August air, the faint hesitation in his once commanding voice. By August 13, the pain had transformed into an internal inferno, burning from within as his body began its slow descent into rot. Fagan prescribed laudanum, a potent mixture of opium and wine, but it barely touched the edge of the suffering. Meanwhile, a small black spot, no larger than a coin, appeared on his leg. The valet noticed it, but Fagan dismissed it as a minor bruise, prescribing more of his usual remedies. What he ignored, or perhaps failed to recognize, was necrosis, tissue death spreading insidiously, the early stages of gangrene, where the blood supply to extremities fails and flesh begins to die while still in use. Louis XIV, after decades of indulgent feasting on meats and sweets, almost certainly suffered from diabetes, a condition unknown to 18th-century medicine. Circulation, humors, and the balance of bodily fluids dominated medical understanding. Yet while science failed him, the narrative of his divine invincibility clashed horrifically with the physical reality of decay. By August 15, the Feast of the Assumption, he gave his last public performance. Carried to the chapel, his body weakened, he endured the Massachusetts witnesses described a gray face, lips tinged blue, the first hints of the smell of rotting flesh clinging to his garments. Courtiers discreetly held perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses, but nothing could entirely mask the inevitable. By that night, his leg had swollen to twice its normal size, a creeping black stain moving ominously up toward the knee, weeping foul fluids. Fagan, finally admitting some uncertainty, summoned 4 of France's most celebrated physicians on August 17. The leg, now a grotesque purple-black mass, was examined, and in hushed Latin, they pronounced terms like mortification and putrefaction. Their remedy? Donkey milk baths, camphorated dressings, and bloodletting, a procedure so ill-advised that Louis fainted thrice in agony. Yet when he awoke, he asked plainly, "Am I dying?" They lied. With rest and treatment, recovery is assured. Meanwhile, the corridors of Versailles were abuzz with a grim anticipation. The political vultures circled. Philip d'Orléans, the king's nephew, sent riders to Paris to consolidate his support. The Duke of Maine, Louis's legitimized son, maneuvered to protect his inheritance. All while the Sun King, still conscious, still commanding, lay in his bed of torment, aware of the decay but still performing the rituals of sovereignty. Imagine witnessing your own body betray you, day after day, while everyone around you either ignores your pain or pretends it's not happening. If you want to see the shocking story of how even the most powerful man in Europe faced the slow, agonizing truth of mortality, stay with us, you won't believe what comes next. You've heard of kings and glory, but have you ever seen a monarch confronted by the raw, unflinching horror of death? Louis XIV's final days are a lesson in power, pride, and the cruel impartiality of fate. Keep watching, because the story only gets darker from here. After decades of ruling France with absolute authority, Louis XIV, the Sun King, rose on the morning of August 10, 1715, to begin his day with the same meticulous ritual he had followed for 72 years. At 76, his body was frail, but his will remained ironclad. The grand lever, the ceremonial dressing before the eyes of chosen nobles, would commence at 8:30 sharp, as it had for decades, each button and buckle a symbol of power, each gesture a rehearsal in authority. Even in old age, Louis upheld his image, refusing to yield to the weakness of age. Versailles, the golden palace he had built to reflect his glory, demanded it. Yet that morning, he craved escape. The rigid choreography of court life, the constant scrutiny, the endless petitions, it suffocated him. So Louis retreated to his favorite pastime, hunting in the forests of Marly. For hours, he rode through the woods, revisiting familiar paths that had echoed with the sounds of his youth. The exercise was grueling, 6 hours in the saddle for a man of his age, yet Louis moved with surprising stamina. Courtiers accompanying him noted his spirits were high, he joked, laughed, and appeared fully in command of both his body and mind. Nothing seemed amiss. But on the journey home, as his carriage approached the gates of Versailles, a subtle, sharp pain began to gnaw at his left leg, just above the knee. It was not intense, merely enough to make him shift in the saddle, dismissible to a lesser man, but to Louis, every sensation was observed, calculated, and measured. By evening, he limped slightly, a fact that did not escape the attention of his attendants. Enter Guy Crescent Fagin, the king's chief physician, whose reputation for brilliance was already tarnished by his stubborn adherence to outdated medical doctrine. Fagin examined the king briefly, noted a slight swelling, and concluded it was nothing more than sciatica, a minor ailment to be treated with rest and herbal remedies. He prescribed pick uses, a standard treatment of the era, and advised patience. Louis, however, refused to rest. He could not. Weakness, even temporary, was unthinkable for a monarch who had positioned himself as the very center of France and Europe. The next morning, August 11th, Louis resumed his daily rituals. He attended the Grand Lever, went through his mass obligations, and presided over the Council of State. The pain in his leg persisted, sometimes burning, sometimes stabbing, yet his face betrayed nothing. Observant courtiers noted subtle signs, white-knuckled grips, beads of sweat despite the cool August air, and a hesitant pause over meals he usually consumed with unrelenting appetite. Even Madame de Maintenon, his secret wife, could not ignore the discomfort etched across his body. She watched in quiet concern as he barely touched his food, an unthinkable departure from the king who could effortlessly consume 12 courses without hesitation. That small, nearly imperceptible black spot appeared for the first time around this period, barely the size of a coin, on the king's leg. The attendants noticed and alerted Fagin, but the physician dismissed it as a simple bruise, nothing more, and instructed continued applications of poultices. He did not, or chose not, to see the underlying danger. Necrosis, the earliest stage of gangrene, had begun, silently devouring the Sun King's flesh from within. By the end of August 11th, Louis XIV remained in control, commanding the routines of Versailles with practiced precision, all while a silent, unstoppable killer had already taken root in his body. The first whisper of decay had begun, unnoticed, ignored, and underestimated, a quiet prelude to the horror that would soon engulf the palace. It started as a simple hunting trip, a day in the forests he had roamed since childhood. But in those quiet moments on horseback, the first sign of a catastrophe appeared, an injury dismissed by those sworn to protect him. Watch closely, because what seems small can grow into a nightmare even the Sun King couldn't escape. His doctors looked at him and saw nothing to fear, telling him to rest, to ignore the pain, but history will show how deadly their mistake became. Subscribe to Tale of History, stay with us as we follow the terrifying consequences of pride, denial, and a single misjudged black spot. By August 12, 1715, the subtle pain in Louis XIV's leg had begun to transform into something more persistent, more insistent. What had been a fleeting twinge now radiated steadily, like fire burning just beneath the surface of his flesh. Yet the Sun King, who had spent 72 years commanding armies, shaping nations, and molding the destiny of France, refused to yield to weakness. Versailles demanded performance, and Louis would not allow himself to be diminished, even by his own body. He continued his daily routines with remarkable determination. The Grand Lever had passed, but there were still ceremonies to attend, ministers to meet, and the endless flow of petitions to review. Each step caused him pain, each movement was carefully measured to conceal the growing disability. To the untrained eye, Louis appeared unchanged, composed, regal, and immovable. But those closest to him noticed subtle changes, the slight limp when he moved from chair to chair, the hesitant grip of his hand as he raised it to sign documents, the pale flush that crept across his once vibrant complexion. Madame de Maintenon, watching from the shadows, observed that the king barely touched his meals, a startling departure from the man who had once consumed 12 elaborate courses without hesitation. She noticed the furrow in his brow, the rapid, shallow breaths that accompanied minor exertion, and the faint sweat clinging to his forehead despite the mild August air. It was clear, Louis was suffering, but neither pride nor duty would allow him to acknowledge it openly. The small black spot, now slightly larger and more defined, had begun to draw attention. Servants whispered about the discoloration and the faint swelling around the joint. When brought to Fagin's attention, the physician remained confident in his misdiagnosis. He insisted that this was merely bruising or inflammation caused by minor trauma from the hunting trip. Fagin's prescribed remedy continued to be poultices and small doses of opiates mixed in wine, intended to dull discomfort rather than treat the underlying condition. His failure to recognize the true danger was a combination of medical ignorance and rigid adherence to outdated theory. The humoral system, which governed 18th-century medicine, had no concept of infection or necrosis. By August 13, the pain had become sharper, more like a torch burning from within. The black spot had begun to expand, creeping outward like ink spreading across a page. Yet the king, ever mindful of appearances, pressed on with public appearances. He attended mass, presided over council meetings, and received visitors with the same composure that had defined his reign. Observers noted the unnatural stillness in his posture, the way he occasionally shifted weight to conceal the swelling in his leg, and the faint discoloration of his skin. To most, it seemed minor, almost ignorable. To those who knew him intimately, the signs were terrifying. By August 15, the Feast of the Assumption, Louis XIV performed his final public ceremony. He was practically carried to the chapel, his frame weakened, his skin pale, lips tinged with blue, yet he remained standing throughout the entire Mass. The smell had begun to creep through his clothing, the first whispers of the sweet, cloying stench of decaying flesh. Courtiers discreetly held perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces, but they did not avert their eyes. The Sun King, even in the first stages of mortal decline, demanded to be seen, to be acknowledged, to remain sovereign over his court, even as his body betrayed him. Fagin, undeterred by the visible signs of worsening necrosis, continued to insist on conservative treatment, delaying any radical intervention that might have saved the king. In these days of denial, the stage was set for the slow, inexorable advance of gangrene, a disease that would strip Louis XIV of his flesh, his mobility, and eventually, his life, while leaving him conscious and aware of every horrifying detail. The king continued his public appearances, standing tall for his courtiers while inside, his body was quietly breaking apart. Each smile, each gesture, was a mask hiding an unimaginable pain. If you think power can shield someone from human suffering, think again. Louis XIV's decline will challenge everything you believe. By August 15, the first undeniable signs of decay had begun. The stench, the black spots, the swelling, they were ignored or misunderstood. But Louis remained the Sun King in public, a terrifying image of denial and human fragility. Keep watching to witness the chilling gap between appearance and reality. By August 16, 1715, the subtle warnings of pain and discoloration had grown impossible to ignore. The black spot on Louis XIV's left leg was no longer a mere blemish, it had swollen, darkened, and spread with alarming speed. The flesh surrounding it had begun to shine unnaturally, taut and glistening under the light of Versailles, and tiny cracks formed across the skin, exuding a foul-smelling fluid. Each day brought new agony, yet the Sun King maintained his composure in public, insisting on the same rigid routines that had defined his reign. The courtiers, familiar with his strength, attempted to treat his continued presence in ceremonies as a triumph of will. But the smell, sweet, sickly, and unmistakable, began to permeate the palace halls. Perfumed handkerchiefs no longer masked it, whispers of fear spread among the attendants and nobles alike. Recognizing the limits of his own competence, or perhaps to protect himself from blame, Fagin, Louis XIV's chief physician, called in reinforcements on August 17. 4 of France's most celebrated doctors arrived at Versailles, each renowned in the medical circles of Europe, bringing with them confidence, instruments, and remedies based on the humoral theories of the day. Their arrival was more political than practical, a display meant to assure the court that the king's condition was being addressed by the finest minds. The doctors inspected the king's leg, now grotesquely swollen, with skin mottled in deep purple and black. The black spot had crept up from his foot toward the knee, a creeping shadow across what had once been a regal limb. They muttered terms in Latin, mortification, putrefaction, the language of disease as myth and ritual rather than science. Their proposed remedies were a mix of baths in donkey milk, compresses of camphorated spirits, and repeated bloodletting, treatments that reflected tradition rather than an understanding of gangrene. Louis XIV endured the procedures stoically, though the strain was visible. His body weakened by pain, poor nutrition, and the advancing infection, he fainted 3 times during treatment. Each time he revived, the king would ask plainly, "Am I dying?" And each time, the physicians evaded the truth, assuring him that his constitution was remarkably strong and recovery was still possible. To them, it was easier to lie than to confront the reality of a monarch whose condition had surpassed the limits of contemporary medicine. Meanwhile, the swelling and necrosis continued unchecked. The blackened tissue spread day by day, the smell intensifying, forcing servants to burn incense almost constantly to keep the air bearable. Louis, though conscious and aware of his deterioration, persisted in state business from his bed, signing documents with a trembling hand and issuing orders to ministers who flinched at the stench. The combination of physical decay and the denial of his physicians created a cruel tension, a king fully aware of his body's betrayal, yet repeatedly reassured that all was well. By August 20th, the stage had been set for the inevitable. The infection had advanced beyond the point of simple remedies. Louis XIV's body was entering the irreversible phase of gangrene, and the delay caused by medical failure had transformed a treatable condition into a death sentence. The court, meanwhile, sensed the impending disaster. Rumors swirled, factions formed, and the palace atmosphere shifted from ceremony to anxious anticipation. The Sun King, ever mindful of appearances, maintained his dignity, but the rotting reality of his leg and the futility of his treatments marked the beginning of the end. His leg was no longer simply injured, it had turned into a grotesque spectacle of swelling, blackened flesh, and the unmistakable signs of gangrene. And yet, the doctors continued to misdiagnose and prescribe useless remedies, sealing a fate even the king could not escape. Subscribe to Tale of History now. Don't look away, this is where the horror truly begins. As Louis XIV's condition deteriorated between August 21st and 24th, the Palace of Versailles transformed from a hub of ceremonial grandeur into a tense arena of political maneuvering. The king, though still conscious, was visibly weakened. His left leg, now swollen and blackened with advancing gangrene, emitted a stench that no amount of perfumed handkerchiefs could mask. Yet the Sun King's mind remained sharp, he continued issuing orders and signing decrees, his dignified composure forcing courtiers to suppress their fear and disgust. While Louis clung to the last vestiges of his authority, the members of his family and court began positioning themselves for what they assumed was inevitable, the king's death. The question of succession, though formally settled in law, became a practical contest of influence. Philip d'Orléans, the king's nephew, moved swiftly, sending riders to Paris to secure support among ministers, military officers, and influential nobles. Every courier carried coded messages, updates on the king's condition, and instructions to rally allies. Philip's strategy was clear: anticipate the end and ensure his regency would be uncontested. Meanwhile, the Duke of Maine, Louis XIV's legitimized son, mobilized his own faction. Though illegitimate by birth, he had been granted status and favor late in the king's reign, and now he sought to solidify his position before the court could fully coalesce around Philip d'Orléans. Maine's efforts included gathering loyal officers, negotiating with ministers, and reinforcing alliances with distant noble houses. Both factions operated like vultures circling the apex predator, fully aware that the moment of the Sun King's passing would determine the balance of power in France. The courtiers themselves began to sense the gravity of the moment. Small whispers in corridors, furtive glances, and the subtle shifting of loyalties created a charged atmosphere. Each noble weighed carefully how to position themselves, whether to pledge loyalty to the heir apparent, the regent, or hedge their bets entirely. Servants, aides, and minor officials were swept up in the tension, forced to anticipate orders before the king's next command or the faction's next maneuver. Versailles, once a theater of controlled splendor, had become a stage for opportunism, anxiety, and quiet panic. Meanwhile, Louis XIV's physicians continued their failing interventions, alternating between procedures, herbal remedies, and reassurances. The king, fully aware of his physical decline, was now forced to witness the subtle scheming of those closest to him. This created a cruel psychological pressure. He remained sovereign in name, yet powerless to control the ambitions of his court. Observers noted that the Sun King's gaze, though still commanding, occasionally betrayed a flash of despair or resignation, as if recognizing the limits of human influence in the face of death. By August 24, it was clear that the death watch was underway. Courtiers moved strategically, family members whispered alliances, and the palace operated on dual rhythms, the external performance of etiquette and public duty, and the private maneuverings of a court fully aware that the Sun King's long reign was approaching its final, irreversible chapter. Each day, Louis XIV's body weakened, and each day, the courtiers' machinations grew more precise, preparing for the moment when the king would no longer stand between ambition and power. While Louis's body decayed, the corridors of Versailles were filled with whispers, scheming, and the ruthless maneuverings of men eager to seize power. Factions formed around succession, letters flew, and the vultures circled the dying king. Watch closely to see how human ambition thrives even in the shadow of death. August 25, 1715, marked the feast day of St. Louis, a date of profound personal significance for Louis XIV. Traditionally, the Sun King had used this day to demonstrate his piety, his authority, and his connection to the lineage of his canonized ancestor, Louis IX. But this year, the day became a grim turning point, revealing the limits of even the most absolute power when confronted with human frailty. Despite the swelling and blackening of his left leg, Louis insisted on appearing before his court. Valets struggled to assist him into his ceremonial robes, and the once effortless gestures of dressing were now agonizing, each movement sending flashes of burning pain through his leg. Courtiers noticed his usual grace was replaced by stiffness, his face, once the mask of calm authority, betrayed the strain. Every step was laborious, and the elegant silk stockings that were part of his regalia became instruments of horror. When they were drawn over his necrotic leg, the fabric tore away in places, pulling with it blackened, liquefied flesh. At that moment, the Sun King screamed, a sound never before heard from him in public. It echoed through the corridors of Versailles, shattering the rigid decorum that had been maintained for decades. The smell of decay was immediate and overwhelming, forcing some attendants to cover their faces, while others silently retched. It was a stark reminder that death, unlike kingship, spares no one. The scream was not just physical, it was symbolic. For the first time, Louis XIV's mortal vulnerability became undeniable to all who witnessed it. Unable to complete the public ceremony, he was carried back to his bedchamber. Yet even in retreat, his mind remained clear and commanding. Louis continued to issue orders and receive petitions, conducting state business from the confines of his chamber while his body deteriorated. The contrast was horrifying, a man still exercising authority over an empire while his flesh was literally failing him from the inside out. The courtiers were caught between awe and terror. Some saw the king's courage as inspirational, others, paralyzed by fear and the stench of his decay, whispered about the approaching succession. The factions that had begun forming earlier now intensified their preparations, anticipating that Louis's death was imminent. Letters were dispatched, alliances quietly renegotiated, and strategic positions assumed, even as the king remained alive, conscious, and suffering. By the evening of August 25, the full extent of the gangrene became undeniable. The leg had swollen dramatically, the black and green tissue starting to soften, weep, and emit a cloying stench that would linger in the palace for days. The physicians, already failing in their interventions, could only offer rudimentary care, dressing the wound in layers of camphor and wine, a symbolic gesture rather than a true remedy. Louis, in his stoic clarity, accepted their ministrations without complaint, but the pain was evident, as were the occasional grimaces and murmured prayers. This day would be remembered not for the pomp of royal ceremony, but for the raw confrontation with mortality. The Sun King had broken, both physically and symbolically, and the world watched as absolute power met its ultimate equal, human frailty. For Louis XIV, this was the first public acknowledgement that even a lifetime of glory could not shield him from decay and death. The king's final public appearance ended in horror, the silk stockings tore, blood and blackened flesh revealed the extent of his suffering, and for the first time, Louis screamed. The image of a god-king brought low by mortality is unforgettable. Subscribe to our channel, like, comment and share. With the St. Louis feast day behind him, Louis XIV retreated entirely to his bedchamber, confined by the relentless progression of gangrene in his left leg. The public had seen the first signs of his vulnerability. Now, behind closed doors, the full scope of his suffering unfolded. The Sun King, who had for decades projected invincibility and divine authority, faced the reality of his mortality with a clarity that was both tragic and extraordinary. On August 26, he summoned his 5-year-old great-grandson, the future Louis XV. In the thick, heavy air of the royal bedchamber, permeated with the stench of necrotic flesh, the young boy approached in wide-eyed fear, dressed in the finery of court, utterly unprepared for the horrors he would witness. Louis XIV, despite his agony, drew the child close and spoke words that were unusually candid, almost confessional. He warned of the dangers of excessive ambition, of love for war, and of the burdens of luxury unchecked by responsibility. He urged the boy to relieve the suffering of his people, a stark admission of the failings of his own reign. The advice was delivered with the gravitas of a king, but also with the vulnerability of a man confronting the end of life. The child left the chamber trembling, unable to fully comprehend the weight of the guidance he had received, yet the moment would echo through his future rule. Over the following days, from August 27 to 29, Louis XIV engaged in a series of private audiences with his closest courtiers and family members. Each encounter was carefully measured. He called them individually to avoid overwhelming his weakened state, offering thanks for loyalty, seeking forgiveness for any past wrongs, and imparting final counsel. Courtiers wept openly, not only for the king's imminent death but for the loss of an era in which the Sun King had been the central axis of French life. Some had spent their entire lives in his service, witnessing his grandeur, and now confronted the humbling spectacle of his decline. During these days, the gangrene spread further, consuming flesh from foot to thigh. Physicians administered basic care, applying dressings, camphor, and other palliative measures, but nothing could halt the march of necrosis. Louis's mental acuity remained remarkable. He continued to sign documents, make decisions, and direct affairs of state from his bed, demonstrating a mind unbroken even as his body betrayed him completely. In private moments with Madame de Maintenon, his secret wife, he acknowledged the extremity of his condition, speaking with a rare vulnerability about his fear and his acceptance. He requested that she remain close, providing comfort as his body grew weaker and fever consumed him. The court outside the chamber, meanwhile, continued its quiet maneuvering for power, aware that the king's death was only days away. Alliances shifted, letters flew between Versailles, Paris, and beyond, while the dying monarch's attention remained on those he loved and the advice he could impart to the next generation. These final days revealed a man stripped of pretense, confronting the consequences of decades of absolute power. Louis XIV's farewell was not only a personal reckoning but a symbolic passing of the torch, a reminder that even kings, regardless of wealth and authority, are bound by the same mortality that claims every human being. As Louis summoned his courtiers one by one, sharing final advice and farewells, the palace became a house of shadows. Each step, each word, carried the weight of centuries of power now fading into history. Stay with us, because what follows is the intimate, heartbreaking side of a king facing the end that no throne could prevent. Imagine being surrounded by loyalty and opulence, yet knowing every breath might be your last. Louis XIV, the Sun King, navigated his final days with dignity and fear intertwined. Keep watching as we reveal the human side of a monarch who seemed larger than life, but in the end, was only human. By August 27, the gravity of Louis XIV's condition could no longer be denied. The gangrene that had begun as a small black spot above his knee now consumed his leg in a grotesque procession of decay. Surgeons examined the limb with increasing alarm. The flesh had blackened, swollen, and in places liquefied, while the odor of necrosis saturated the room, overpowering the fragrances intended to mask it. Every finger pressed into the tissue met with a shocking softness. The bone itself seemed to yield to the disease. It was the definitive moment when the court's greatest illusion of invulnerability collided with the harsh reality of mortality. A surgeon named Marechal, one of the few with the courage to speak openly, finally confronted the king with the truth. Taking Louis's hand in his, he explained the unthinkable. Amputation might extend life for a matter of days, perhaps hours, but could not save him. The infection had reached the bone, no human intervention could halt its advance. The king, who had long commanded armies, enacted grand ceremonies, and ruled as if divine, absorbed the words with a calm that stunned even the physicians. He looked at the blackened, rotting limb, saw what they all could see, and nodded. "I have lived as a king," Louis said, his voice measured despite the pain, "at least let me die as a Christian." There was no panic, no desperate clinging to life through futile surgery, only the clear-eyed acceptance of a man confronting the inevitable. He refused amputation, insisting that if death was certain, he would not be mutilated unnecessarily. This decision shocked the medical staff, yet in his refusal, he asserted a final control over his life and body, an echo of the authority that had defined him for 72 years. In the following days, August 28th to 30th, the king's mind remained astonishingly lucid even as his body deteriorated further. The gangrene crept relentlessly upward, liquefying muscle, exposing sinew, and producing a stench so overwhelming that servants and attendants worked in constant rotation, burning incense and perfumes to mask it. Despite the agony, Louis continued to issue decrees, sign documents, and attend to matters of state, his will unbroken by physical torment. Physicians were helpless. Their treatments, poultices, bleeding, and camphor dressings, offered no reprieve. A healer named Brun later entered the bedchamber claiming an elixir that might cure the gangrene, giving Louis a brief, almost hallucinatory improvement. But the relief was fleeting. Within hours, the fever returned, and the pain roared through the rotting limb with renewed intensity. The king's suffering was not merely physical, it was the humiliation of human vulnerability, laid bare before those who had long worshipped him as infallible. In these final days, Louis XIV displayed a remarkable combination of dignity, courage, and insight. He recognized the limitations of both medicine and mortality, accepting the inevitability of death with stoicism. The refusal of amputation was a conscious, deliberate choice, a final act of autonomy, asserting that even as his body failed, his will remained sovereign. Courtiers observed in awe and horror as the Sun King, whose life had been defined by grandeur, ceremony, and the illusion of immortality, faced his own decay with unflinching clarity, preparing for the final act of his extraordinary life. Surgeons confirmed what everyone feared, the gangrene had reached the bone. Amputation could save him, but the Sun King refused. Witness the harrowing choice of pride over survival, and the unflinching courage of a man who chose to meet fate on his own terms. Don't look away, this is power, mortality, and human will colliding in one tragic chapter. Every moment stretched longer, each step more painful, and yet Louis faced the inevitable with stoic resolve. The decision to refuse surgery was more than defiance, it was a declaration, a final act of control over a life that had ruled millions. Stay tuned, because the agony is far from over, and history will never forget this moment. As August 30th unfolded, the Sun King's condition teetered on the edge between desperation and despair. Louis XIV lay in his bed, the gangrene having claimed almost the entirety of his left leg, the skin blackened, swollen, and peeling, emitting a stench so potent that even the strongest perfumes barely masked it. His body was a battlefield, and no physician's art could reclaim lost ground. Yet, in this darkest hour, a glimmer of hope emerged, however illusory it would prove to be. A man named Brun, claiming to be a healer from Versailles, managed to gain access to the royal bedchamber. He carried with him a small vial of red liquid, asserting that it was an elixir capable of halting the progress of gangrene. The official physicians protested vehemently, warning of charlatanry, but Louis, exhausted, pained, and perhaps curious, consented. Desperation drove the decision. After all, what did he have to lose when the infection had already devoured his leg and with it, the illusion of invincibility? Brun administered the drops carefully, and almost immediately, the king appeared to rally. His fever, which had surged relentlessly, began to subside. For the first time in days, Louis requested food. A minor, almost human gesture, but monumental after a period of starvation induced by agony. The courtiers in the outer chambers, long tense with fear and speculation, dared to whisper of a miracle. Preparations for succession, hastily organized by ambitious factions within Versailles, were abruptly paused as hope flickered through the corridors. For a brief few hours, the Sun King's face regained some color, his breathing steadied, and his eyes, though weary, held a spark of life. The palace seemed to exhale collectively, as though the very air had been holding its breath during his decline. Messages were sent to Paris, updates carried with careful optimism. Philip d'Orléans, ever calculating, allegedly paled at the thought that the king might survive longer than anticipated, disrupting the fragile balance of power that had already begun to shift. Yet the reprieve was cruelly short-lived. As evening descended, the elixir's effect waned. The fever returned with renewed intensity, and the pain in Louis's leg, numbed temporarily by the progression of necrosis, erupted like fire through his nerves. The soft, blackened flesh, once grotesquely pliable, became a source of unbearable torment. Every movement, every touch brought screams from the king, cries that echoed through the corridors and reminded everyone of the inescapable power of mortality. Louis spent the night of August 30th to 31st in excruciating agony. The agony was not only physical but existential, the recognition that all the pomp, all the wealth, all the armies he commanded could not bend the laws of nature. Surrounded by attendants, courtiers, and physicians, he cried out, invoked God, and begged for release. Every pulse of life in him was matched by the relentless march of decay. It was a cruel lesson in the limits of human power. Even a king who had styled himself as a god could not evade the intimate horror of his own body's betrayal. By the night's end, Louis's hope, sparked briefly by Brun, had evaporated. The king was left in full awareness of his impending death, his body ravaged, his leg a grotesque monument to biological inevitability. The palace, usually alive with ceremony and calculated grandeur, had transformed into a theater of suffering, a stark reminder that even the Sun King was subject to the immutable laws of mortality. Brun's elixir offered a fleeting glimmer of hope, a temporary reprieve from the relentless pain. But the relief was brief, and the darkness returned, more unforgiving than ever. The Sun King's screams echoed through the halls, a chilling reminder that even the mighty are not immune to human suffering. Don't turn away. Louis's last hours reveal the terrifying fragility behind power and glory, a lesson in humility and horror. The dawn of September 1st, 1715, broke slowly over Versailles, its golden halls now shadowed by the inevitability of death. Louis XIV, the Sun King who had ruled France for 72 years, lay in his bed, the culmination of 22 days of agonizing decline. The merciless gangrene had finally completed its advance, claiming his leg entirely, leaving him weakened, fevered, and shrouded in the stench of decay. Yet his mind had remained clear almost until the end, a cruel witness to the collapse of his own body. By 8:15 a.m., the king's breathing slowed into ragged, shallow gasps. Madame de Montreal held his hand, whispering words of comfort, while his confessor, Jesuit Père Letellier, intoned prayers over him. Physicians, exhausted and defeated, hovered nearby, powerless to alter the course that nature had decreed. The king's chest rose and fell with diminishing strength, his lips moving faintly in fragmented Latin prayers. Moments stretched with unbearable tension as attendants and courtiers watched the final act of a life that had dominated the stage of Europe for decades. At last, the inevitable occurred. Louis XIV's breath faltered, stopping and starting with fragile rhythm. A courtier approached, holding a small mirror to the king's lips. No fog appeared. The room fell into a tense silence. Then, with quiet solemnity, a voice declared, "The king is dead." In that instant, chaos erupted. Philip d'Orléans, nephew and heir to the regency, acted swiftly. He left the room to secure the levers of power, issuing orders to loyal supporters and consolidating authority before rivals could react. The Duke of Maine, Louis XIV's legitimized son, attempted to assert influence but found the path blocked by Philip's guards. Courtiers scattered in every direction, some racing to align themselves with the new power, others retreating to private estates to await the tide of events. Versailles, usually a theater of disciplined hierarchy and controlled spectacle, had dissolved into a frantic scramble for survival and advantage. Within the royal bedchamber, the body of Louis XIV remained as both a symbol and a warning. The decay that had tormented him in life now dominated the space. His servants burned incense and perfumes desperately, attempting to mask the potent aroma of death, but it was a losing battle. The Mercury Room, prepared for ceremonial display, bore witness to the grotesque reality: a king brought low by disease, mortality, and the relentless march of biological decay. The immediate aftermath of Louis XIV's death was as political as it was personal. Factions moved quickly to stake claims and secure positions in a court that had never before seen such a sudden void of authority. The regency of Philip d'Orléans was confirmed almost immediately, his decisive action preventing an open struggle for power that could have destabilized France further. The Duke of Maine and other potential rivals were sidelined, their influence diminished by speed, strategy, and circumstance. And so, the Sun King, whose life had been defined by power, spectacle, and the meticulous orchestration of every detail, fell victim to the ultimate equalizer, death. In his final moments, surrounded by human frailty, he had been stripped of all the trappings of grandeur, leaving behind a France at the cusp of transition, a court in turmoil, and a vivid, grotesque testament to the impermanence of even the most absolute authority. When Louis XIV finally succumbed, the palace erupted in chaos. Courtiers scrambled, factions moved, and Philip d'Orléans seized control. The death of a king was more than personal tragedy, it was the spark that ignited political storms. Subscribe now, stay with us, because the ripples of this moment reshaped France in ways you've never imagined. Imagine the final breath of a man who had ruled for decades, now replaced by whispers, intrigue, and the ruthless ambition of those around him. This is history at its most raw, a moment when mortality collides with the machinery of power. Keep watching, what follows is as shocking as the king's final moments. With Louis XIV dead, the palace of Versailles descended into an eerie stillness, a contrast to the chaos of the preceding hours. The king's body, once the symbol of absolute power and divine authority, now presented a challenge unlike any before. The merciless march of gangrene had left his legs so decomposed that they had begun to collapse, soft and liquefied, creating a grotesque spectacle that even seasoned royal embalmers hesitated to confront. The Mercury Room, prepared for ceremonial viewing, became the theater of this unsettling reality. Embalming began almost immediately, as tradition demanded that the body of the Sun King be displayed in state before burial. The royal physicians and embalmers, already exhausted from their failed efforts to save him, were faced with a task that seemed impossible. Louis's legs, blackened, swollen, and partially liquefied, could not withstand movement. The embalmers were forced to carefully reconstruct what remained of his lower limbs, essentially pouring the remaining flesh into position to fit the coffin. The smell of decay was overwhelming, a mixture of rotting flesh and chemical preservatives that permeated the Mercury Room and adjacent halls. Courtiers avoided the chamber, and those who entered were often forced to gag or flee. Despite the grotesque state of the body, the display followed royal protocol. The Sun King was placed in his coffin, draped in the luxurious garments of monarchy, surrounded by gold, silk, and velvet. From September 2 to September 10, the coffin remained in the Mercury Room, a macabre symbol of the intersection between human mortality and royal pageantry. Servants burned incense and perfumed the air continuously, attempting to mask the stench of death, but it remained a faintly futile effort. The smell clung to the palace walls and lingered in memory. Royal tradition dictated further ceremonial actions. The body was to be divided into 3 parts, the corpse to be interred at St. Denis, the heart to be preserved and placed in the Jesuits' Church of St. Paul St. Louis, and the entrails to be sent to the Cathedral of Notre Dame. These rituals, meant to honor the king and maintain continuity of royal authority, were complicated by the condition of the remains. The legs, reduced to near liquid state, required careful handling, while the torso and upper body, though intact, bore signs of the fever and decay that had consumed the king in his final days. Observers noted the paradoxical combination of reverence and horror. The courtiers, who had once bowed in awe of the Sun King, now faced the stark reality of mortality. The grandeur of Versailles, the glittering halls, and the golden ornamentation could not conceal the human frailty that death exposed. Even the embalmers, trained for royal procedures, were confronted with the limits of their art. The body had deteriorated beyond what any method could fully preserve. In these days between death and burial, Louis XIV's post-mortem presence served as both a spectacle and a warning. The rituals continued, not merely for tradition, but to assert that even in death, the authority of the Sun King, and by extension, the monarchy, remained visible, tangible, and awe-inspiring, even as decay reminded all of the ultimate equality that death enforces. Louis's death did not end the horror. In the Mercury Room, his body began to decompose, the preparations for display a grotesque testament to vanity and ritual. Witness the chilling procedures, the public coffin displays, and the lengths humanity goes to preserve the illusion of immortality. Subscribe to Tale of History now because the truth is far more haunting than legend. The embalming was a spectacle of both science and terror, a stark reminder that death respects no status, no title. Stay with us as we explore the dark rituals of a king's final honor, revealing the macabre fascination with preserving the mighty long after their life has faded. The death of Louis XIV did more than mark the end of a life, it signaled the unraveling of an era. On September 9, 1715, the public funeral procession to St. Denis proceeded with the ceremonial pomp expected of the Sun King. Torches blazed, prayers were recited, and the nobility lined the streets in silent obedience. Yet even in ritual, there was a subtle undercurrent of fatigue and resentment. For 72 years, France had lived under a monarch whose grandeur demanded absolute loyalty and whose wars bled the nation dry. The physical deterioration of the king mirrored the exhaustion of the state itself. A once glorious monarchy brought low, its splendor now overshadowed by the inevitability of human frailty. During the funeral oration, Bishop Mason broke with traditional glorification. He did not proclaim the greatness of Louis XIV. Instead, he emphasized the supremacy of God, stating plainly, God alone is great. This marked a quiet, profound repudiation of everything Louis had represented. His legendary wars, lavish spending, and self-styled divinity were, in the eyes of contemporaries, diminished by the stark reality of death and decay. The ritualized display of his decomposed body underscored a simple truth: all earthly power, no matter how absolute, could not withstand time or disease. In the immediate aftermath, Philip d'Orléans moved swiftly to secure regency for the young Louis XV, consolidating power and ensuring continuity of governance. The treasury, nearly depleted after decades of costly wars and Versailles construction, left the young king with a fragile inheritance. Louis XV, only 5 years old, stepped into a kingdom burdened by debt, weary from conflict, and morally tested by the spectacle of a long-reigning monarch's agonizing final days. Even as regents managed state affairs, the memory of Louis XIV's prolonged suffering lingered, a reminder of human vulnerability behind the mask of absolute authority. Over time, the legacy of the Sun King became a subject of historical scrutiny. His achievements, the vast expansion of Versailles, the centralization of royal power, and France's dominant role in European politics, were undeniable. Yet historians noted the costs: economic strain, social unrest, and an enduring disconnect between monarchy and populace. Louis XIV's death, prolonged and horrific, became both literal and symbolic evidence of the limits of autocracy. The human body, like the state, could not endure unchecked ambition indefinitely. The Bourbon monarchy itself endured for 2 more generations, ultimately succumbing to the French Revolution. In 1793, revolutionary forces desecrated royal tombs at St. Denis, including the lead coffin of Louis XIV. The lead was melted into bullets, and the remains were dumped into common pits, covered hastily with lime. The king who had once claimed, "L'état, c'est moi," ended as fragments of bone, a final testament to the transience of power and glory. Even centuries later, Louis XIV's prolonged death and its aftermath serve as a chilling reminder: no palace, no army, no divine claim can halt the biological and historical consequences of time, disease, and mortality. The Sun King's story endures not only as a tale of ambition and splendor but as a warning. Absolute power, when tested by the relentless realities of life and death, is fragile. His agonizing final days revealed what no court, no advisor, and no wealth could shield, that beneath the gold and silk, all men, kings included, are subject to the same mortal laws. Louis XIV's rotting, conscious body, and the chaos that followed his death remain etched into history as a lesson in human fragility, political consequence, and the inescapable truth of mortality. Louis XIV's death left France forever changed. His inheritance passed to Louis XV, but the monarchy's grandeur could not shield his successors from future upheaval. Revolutions would strip away the remnants of his reign, yet the lessons of power, pride, and mortality remain vivid. The Sun King's story is not just about a man, but about the rise and fall of an era. From opulent courts to revolutionary fury, his life and death shaped centuries. If the story of Louis XIV has shown us anything, it's that behind every crown lies human vulnerability, ambition, and moments that can shake the course of history. If you want to uncover more untold stories of power, betrayal, and secrets that shaped the world, make sure you subscribe to Tale of History and hit the notification bell. We dive deep into the lives, deaths, and dark truths of history's most fascinating figures, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Join our journey into the shadows of the past, because history is never as it seems.